So, for my federal agency, I chose to do the Coast Guard, and that was for several reasons. First off, because I actually work with a guy that's in the Coast Guard Reserves, which he does a once every 2 week kind of thing that he has to do on the weekends, and then once a year he goes on a little adventure too. Also, because I love Deadliest Catch and Wicked Tuna fishing shows, which uh, they have to do a lot with the Coast Guard, always have some beef with them. Also, I took a terrible boater safety class. And lastly, I made a Coast Guard helicopter as a derby car once, which I couldn't find. But just so you believe me, I'll show you. I have this derby car here, which is also pretty good. It's a cement truck. Just to show you, I'm actually pretty creative. So, first off, this Coast Guard I read was founded in 1790 on August 4, which is a long time ago, that's for sure. Um, their motto is Semper Pavatus, which means it's always ready in Latin. I'm pretty sure. I didn't look that up, but I'm pretty sure. And they have three things on their code: honor, respect, and devotion. So the Coast Guard is a lot more serious than I thought, which, if you work for one of the seven uniformed services of America, then it's got to be pretty serious, which, yeah, it's one of the seven uniformed services. Um, so as of 2008, they are part of the Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security. Before that, they were Department of Transportation. Um, and so one other cool part is they are also considered a military service. So, like, if we go to a war or a conflict, then the president is allowed to assign these Coast Guard uniformed people to work with the Navy, which it has happened almost every conflict we have had, or some 17 times or something. Like, I know I read that the Coast Guard drove some of those ships on D-Day in Normandy, which is kind of cool. So the Coast Guard has quite a few responsibilities that I read about, and it's all covered under these 11 missions, but I found seven main responsibilities that they have. So first, search and rescue, which has to do a lot with like the wicked tuna fishing type of people. The maritime law enforcement, which is super important, maybe their most important job. Navigation aid, ice breaking, kind of funny, environmental protection, port security, and lastly, military readiness, like what I just talked about. So, some cool facts that kind of go along with those responsibilities is for like search and rescue on a daily basis, they like help around 109 people. And so they'll save around 10 people a day and assist about 192 people in distress. So that's a lot of people just from the start. And I also forgot to mention, right now there is about 87,000 people that are part of the Coast Guard. About 40,000 of them are active, or 41,000. And that was the latest update on their website. Also, the maritime law enforcement is like smuggling, piracy, which is like why that the Coast Guard was formed in the first place, and also to enforce tariffs and stuff. Aids to navigation. One fact is every day they aid 135 boats to wherever they need to go to help navigate their way. Ice breaking, self-explanatory. Environmental protection, which this is also a very large part. So they, on average daily, they help 20 spills, whether it's oil or other chemicals in the ocean, and they are always on top of something like that, like BP oil spill. Way back in the day, that was a huge thing. The Coast Guard was the first to respond to that. And port security, which right now, especially with the coronavirus, is very, very important. On the daily average, they have to search 100 vessels, which I'll get into this later in the video, how they're going into a lot more depth with their searches. And yeah, and also military readiness, like I talked about. So some other just little facts I'll ramble off quick. They seize about 170 pounds of marijuana and 306 pounds of cocaine a day, which is almost around $10 million worth of illegal drugs, and also 14 illegal immigrants a day, and will protect almost $3 million in people's property, which is obviously why we pay taxes for the Coast Guard, to help protect us. Some of the things that they have all sorts of weapons, boats, aircrafts, and something that the Coast Guard just absolutely loves is these things called cutters, which are just boats. Like, they had a hockey team, amateur hockey team, that was called the Cutters, and every website I went on was like all about these cutters. And I don't know, every Coast Guard branch has this love for these boats, and all it is a vessel more than 65 feet long. But apparently, if it's not a part of the Coast Guard, it can't be considered a cutter. So whatever that has to do with it. And so then I kind of went into even more depth with like what's going on right now with the Coast Guard and like with the coronavirus. So pretty much I read a quick article about how they're the closest military service to the coronavirus, considering like all of that's going on and being involved with it. And so every month they are screening 4,000 ships for coronavirus. Like, every ship that comes in has to be screened by the Coast Guard. Now, also on top of that, they're also developing processes in warehouses for equipment like ventilators, and to make masks, and to help, just like what General Motors and Ford has been doing, and other big companies like that. They also help at the beginning quarantine like worldwide travelers, like people that were coming from China. They had to help them get into quarantine, and everything all about that. And I just read an article they put out a few days ago that just because all these Coast Guard members are so close to the coronavirus, that there has been over 90 people in the Coast Guard that have been diagnosed, have tested positive for coronavirus. And so the general of the Coast Guard had made a statement, and he said that the coronavirus is really showing how bad their IT is, or their information technology is. So they have proposed a $3.2 billion bill, something like that. I didn't write it down, to help out their IT, because not everyone, a lot of the people are working from home, and they can't keep up with their technology. And so they're planning on working really closely with the government to upgrade that stuff, and to get it up to date. And so I also found out that there is actually a court for the Coast Guard, which has to do with the unit we're talking about in BizLaw right now, all about courts and about contracts. And so it's called the Coast Guard Court of Criminal Appeals. And it's nothing really special, like it's not some big court, but some ex-Coast Guard commanders that obviously have to be very well informed in law, they will sit on that court. And pretty much it's just a court that oversees all the criminal activity of the Coast Guard. So I read some of the cases, and it was just like possession of marijuana was one of them, and like distribution, and then one guy got a case for like assault. But pretty much you can't mess around in the Coast Guard, so this stuff can get you pretty bad sentences on that. And so yeah, pretty much the rest of this. Oh yeah, and so these 11 missions are like a big part of what the Coast Guard does. And so it talks like, mostly everyone thinks of the Coast Guard as they just search and rescue, and they're a pain in your butt because they check your boats and make sure everything's okay. But in reality, you don't even realize how many lives they save. Also, how much trafficking they get off the market or off the street, and to help America with all that kind of stuff. And also, people might think pirates are like not really a thing, which like the pirates we may think of are not, but there's boats out there that will steal our stuff or other countries' stuff. And also with all that Trump's doing with his ideas on tariffs and making sure that the trade deals are even, then the Coast Guard has to be very fine tuned on controlling these tariffs and these boats going in and out of the U.S. So overall, I didn't know so much about the Coast Guard, but now I'm a little better informed and realize that, yeah, maybe there's hundreds, or not hundreds, but a lot of federal agencies that you may think aren't very important. But I can tell you the Coast Guard is one of the very important ones.